On April 22, a massive explosion rocked the Vladimir region of Russia. A vast munitions depot at the 51st Arsenal of the GRAU, the main missile and artillery directorate of the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation, one of Russia's massive depots responsible for stockpiling and transporting the ammo to the front, was almost completely destroyed. The explosion, reportedly involving over 100,000 tons of ammunition, lit the sky for hours, caused widespread evacuations, and immediately raised alarms in both military and intelligence circles. And there's likely far more at play than a simple explosion of a munitions depot, as this event could have consequences that seep into both the war effort and the entire Russian government. According to initial reports from Russian media and state authorities, the explosion at the 51st Arsenal in the Vladimir region began with a fire that broke out during the handling of explosive materials. The ensuing detonation and subsequent explosions forced the evacuation of nearby towns like Barsovo and Mirny. Official sources claim that improper handling led to the fire, deflecting any suggestion of an external attack. The explosions in the depot itself are likely going to be only a part of the issue for the region. With the munitions depot stockpiling extremely dangerous ordnance, there's a chance that fires and explosions lead to what's called cooking off. This is where the ensuing heat jumpstarts the reactions necessary to launch other ordnance. If left uncontrolled, the explosions could, at least in theory, lead to a complete detonation of all the ordnance stored in the depot, leading to the loss of the entire 100,000 tons of the stored ammunition. In fact, the cook-off effect was already reported via Telegram and other social media channels. Various videos showcased live ammunition and missiles hurled at random directions away from the depot, with some of the ordnance landing up to 7 miles away into homes. Worse yet, in some cases, the ordnance was reportedly still undetonated when it landed, creating a persistent risk to its immediate surroundings. In effect, these undetonated ordnances would require the coordinated effort of bomb defusal squads. An extensive area surrounding the depot needed to be secured and searched for undetonated ordnance. However, several anomalies suggest alternative explanations. Local eyewitnesses described hearing high-pitched whirring sounds, often attributed to drones, shortly before the explosion. This aligns with Ukraine's increasingly effective use of long-range drones to strike targets deep within Russian territory. Moreover, this very arsenal was previously targeted in late 2024, albeit unsuccessfully. Satellite imagery and thermal signatures from NASA's FIRM system revealed a fire and explosion footprint consistent with previous Ukrainian drone strikes. The scale of the blast, visible mushroom cloud, and seismic activity lend credence to the theory of external involvement. The fact that Russian authorities were quick to blame human error might indicate an attempt to contain domestic unrest or conceal the vulnerability of strategic infrastructure. So, what's the truth? Well, this might be more difficult to ascertain, as there are two likely scenarios, and neither of them paints a promising picture of Russia's capabilities to sustain the war effort for long. The first scenario is that Ukraine was directly responsible for the attack, and the country's intelligence services are still considering whether they want to openly admit their involvement. This would mean that the munitions depot, which was located less than 50 miles to the northeast of Moscow, was successfully targeted and destroyed by long-range drones and missile strikes coming all the way from Ukraine. This would be an unprecedented escalation of Ukraine's capabilities, suggesting strikes that can go deeper into Russia's territory than ever before. But it wouldn't be the first time this has happened. Therefore, it's best to compare this event with the one that shares the most similarities, the attack on Toropets. On September 18, 2024, Ukraine launched a large-scale drone strike against the 107th Arsenal in Toropets, a highly fortified depot reportedly storing an estimated 30,000 tons of artillery shells, missiles, and explosives. The strike led to a series of massive explosions, registering a 2.8 on the Richter scale and destroying large sections of the depot. Unlike the Vladimir explosion, which was shrouded in ambiguity, the Toropets strike was openly acknowledged by Ukraine. Video and satellite evidence confirmed the scale of destruction. What was notable wasn't just the success of the strike, but the implications it held for future Ukrainian strategy and Russian defense posturing. The Toropets strike utilized the saturation drone tactic, involving potentially over 100 drones. It exploited weaknesses in Russian air defense, particularly after a Ukrainian operation had reportedly disabled a local radar station, creating a window of vulnerability. The base, which was supposed to be hardened against all but nuclear attack, was reduced to ash. There were a few possible reasons for the sheer scale of Russia's failures to contain the attack. However, the most culpable ones boiled down to a combination of subpar construction, widespread corruption, and poor safety protocols. Furthermore, the two attacks show an astounding number of similarities in the execution and the aftermath. First, there's the actual content of the munition stockpiles. Both the Toropets and the Vladimir region depots contain highly valuable missiles and ordnances for both offensive and defensive aspects of Russia's military equipment. These include the missiles for the S-300 and S-400 anti-air defense systems, which are one of the few ways Russia has maintained multi-layered defenses against Ukrainian airplanes and drone strikes. With Ukraine increasingly dependent on maintaining pressure on Russia, primarily through technological and aerial warfare, including long-range strikes and air-to-surface bombardments, these contemporary defensive systems are vital links that provide Russia with insurance to conduct their own offenses. If Ukraine manages to mount enough attacks, Russia could deplete the ammo used to stock the defensive batteries. With the S-400 having one of the longest detection and interception ranges at around 250 miles, losing these capabilities would present a critical vulnerability in Russia's defensive systems, opening larger swathes of Russia's territory to attack. Second, the actual strikes have similar backgrounds, coverage, satellite imagery, and reactions from the Russian authorities. For example, in both cases, NASA's FIRMS, which stands for Fire Information for Resource Management System, was among the first to pick up on active fires around the area, concentrated on the depots which were consistent with high-energy explosives. Then, video footage showed sprawling mushroom clouds, explosions, and localized tremors. The detonation patterns and scale of the explosions were consistent with that of long-range missiles rather than localized fires. Then there's the matter of how the Russian authorities responded to the attack. While the Ukrainian military immediately announced the success of the attack on the Toropets facility, the Russian media downplayed it as a result of falling debris, refusing to mention any attacks or even the targeting of the military compound. This is consistent with what's being done with the recent explosion at the 51st Arsenal. The Russian government is outright denying any indication or involvement by the Ukrainian military, instead blaming mismanagement and handling of volatile munitions for the devastating results. Finally, in both cases, the initial explosions would only be a prelude to the actual detonations, as the munitions would cook off and detonate due to the heat. This lends significant credence to the theory that the Ukrainian military is actually behind the attack. But why does this matter? Well, the locations and the circumstances are important here. The compound in Toropets is roughly 300 miles away from the Ukrainian border and west of Moscow, being closer to Russia's border with Belarus and the rest of Europe. The 300-mile range would be consistent with the upper ranges of long-range drones that Ukraine was fielding by late 2024. By contrast, the 51st Arsenal is located 50 miles northeast of Moscow itself and is over 310 miles away from the Ukrainian border. More importantly, for a strike to effectively reach the compound, it would have to pass through hundreds of miles of Russia's territory, including going relatively near the Russian capital. The Toropets region is out of the way somewhat, and the attack could utilize the airspace between Belarus and Russia, where the defenses are presumably thinner. The disparity implies that the attack would represent a significant improvement in Ukraine's long-range capabilities. For one thing, there's the fact that the Russian Defense Ministry has not indicated any attack on the compound at any time, whereas there was a confirmed attack in late 2024. This suggests that the anti-air defenses in the area were either successfully spoofed by the Ukrainian military and intelligence services, or that they failed to detect a strike in the first place. The attack would also represent another improvement of Ukraine's already impressive long-range strike capabilities. The country's efforts at pressing deeper into Russia's territory are based solely on drones and missiles due to the fact that its land troops are all being deployed around the border or in Donbass. The attack on Toropets suggested that they had the ability to plan a large-scale assault involving over 100 drones. By contrast, the attack on Vladimir went almost completely unnoticed, indicating that there were fewer attacking vessels in play. It's entirely feasible that the entire attack was conducted by a single-digit number of long-range drones, with each having drastically increased payload size. Increasing the ordnance payload naturally decreases the speed and the range of the drone, so Ukraine's ability to compensate for that and maintain and increase the range is nothing short of impressive. Worse yet, the attack on the 51st Arsenal, if it indeed was one, came roughly 5 months after the first reports of strikes on the compound and more than half a year after the explosions in Toropets. This would have given Russia more than enough time to analyze the failures in existing defenses in supposedly hardened compounds and create a more comprehensive network to protect one of its most vital assets in the war, the military-industrial compound. The fact that Russian military stockpiles and even production facilities are being successfully targeted and even destroyed by Ukraine's long-range strikes undermines the Kremlin's persistent propaganda that Russia is decidedly winning in the war. This is further complicated by the newest attacks effectively being on the other side of Moscow compared to the Russia-Ukraine border. If the attacks can actually reach farther away than the capital, then it might be only a matter of time before some Ukrainian strikes inevitably find their way to the Kremlin itself, compromising Russia's center of governance. Let's not forget that Ukraine actually managed to conduct attacks on the outskirts of Moscow in September of 2024, which showcased that these attacks were a possibility even then. The improved capabilities in the past 8 months make it practically a given, which could destabilize the defensive structure of the entire country. But what about the other possibility, the one where the explosions are entirely due to internal failures of mishandling explosives and ordnance when making, transporting, or even just storing the munitions for the war effort? This paints an entirely different picture of Russia's sheer inability to produce enough munitions to meet the vastly increased demands of the ongoing war. Remember, the entire war effort was supposed to last only 3 days to 3 weeks. More than 3 years and 2 months in, there's practically no end in sight to the conflict, with neither Ukraine nor Russia willing to meet the demands proposed by the US to broker even a successful ceasefire. But let's dig a bit deeper into Russia's munition crisis. Despite dramatic increases in military spending and numerous promises of production ramp-ups, Russian artillery units continue to face shortages of reliable munitions. This disconnect between financial commitment and battlefield reality reveals deeper structural issues within Russia's defense industrial complex. Russia's defense budget has seen unprecedented growth since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine began. Official figures indicate military spending has more than doubled, with special emphasis placed on artillery systems and munitions production. This comes at a cost of spending in other sectors. The Russian news outlet Medusa reported that more than 40% of the country's budget is going to the military or national defense, with a concerning proportion of it classified as secret. Government officials have repeatedly announced ambitious production targets, claiming manufacturing capacity increases of 200 to 300% for certain types of ammunition. In fact, Putin famously noted that Russia's capacity increased 20 times over its figures before the war. This was supported by the country outproducing the entirety of Europe in terms of ammunition at half the overall cost, suggesting that it's found a way to reliably speed up and cheapen the production process. While the reports of the 20-fold increase couldn't be verified with hard numbers, some reports suggested a more than 3-fold increase in artillery ammunition production in 2024 compared to 2023, indicating that Russia has fully engaged its production facilities. However, those same reports couldn't verifiably say whether the increased production stems from improving the capacity to create new munitions or the ability to refurbish older, depreciated ones into functional ordnance. Russia has replaced and improved its artillery, anti-air, and even tank systems since the Soviet era, but it still maintains a healthy supply of old ammunition that wouldn't be seeing active war usage without that refurbishment. And yet, reports from the front lines consistently describe Russian units operating under strict shell rationing policies. Ukrainian intelligence assessments suggest Russian artillery fire rates have decreased significantly from early war levels, despite the strategic importance of artillery in Russian military doctrine. For example, some of the more recent advances attempted by Russia were done solely using infantry in a strategy called human wave attack. The lack of support from either mechanized infantry or artillery during these attempts suggested that Russia was either withholding its munitions for a more substantial effort later or was simply running short of them. It doesn't help that Ukraine has consistently managed to strike deep into Russia to destroy vital munitions stockpiles. The Toropets attack was hardly an isolated incident, as September 2024 saw 3 other depots struck. The losses at the 51st Arsenal would essentially be the icing on the cake, as it's one of the largest single compounds that the country has used so far. This paradox, growing budgets alongside declining ammunition availability, suggests that there's something else at play: Russia's inability to adapt. Many Russian ammunition factories date back to the Soviet era and require significant modernization. Retooling these facilities take time and expertise that Russia simply can't afford at the moment. Western sanctions have restricted access to crucial components and manufacturing equipment. Precision machinery, specialized electronics, and raw materials have become difficult to source as imports of vital tech pieces have halted or been replaced by less effective alternatives from China. The Russian defense industry also faces critical personnel challenges. Experienced engineers and skilled technicians are in short supply. Remember, President Vladimir Putin announced wave after wave of conscription, each using able-bodied men at the exact ages they should be most effective in the production industry and tech services. Additionally, at least 900,000 people left the country within the first year of the invasion, with most of the emigrants belonging to the middle-class workers, which represented Russia's future employees. Furthermore, modern artillery shells require precise manufacturing processes, and the production of propellant, fuses, and shell bodies demands technical expertise that cannot be rapidly scaled. Under pressure to meet unrealistic production quotas, Russian ammunition manufacturers may have compromised on quality control. Reports of premature detonations in Russian artillery pieces have increased dramatically. Duds and shells with inconsistent ballistic performance have been documented extensively. Even if we discount the April 2022 explosion, there have been multiple reports of Russian compounds exploding without Ukrainian interference. All of this implies that the Russian manufacturing of munitions and ordnance has just been expedited or outsourced rather than improved. Russia might be able to produce weapons faster, but it's not testing them sufficiently. This degradation in standards creates a dangerous feedback loop. Unreliable ammunition leads to reduced artillery effectiveness, which increases pressure for more ammunition, further compromising quality. Then there's Russia's pervasive corruption problem. Investigations by independent Russian media have uncovered cases where factories report producing thousands of shells, but they never materialize. Funds are allocated and dispersed, but the ammunition exists only on paper. Mid-level managers at production facilities routinely inflate output figures to meet expectations while diverting resources. Corruption has incentivized the substitution of inferior materials in ammunition components. High-grade metals are replaced with cheaper alternatives, explosive fills are diluted, and quality propellants are swapped for substandard versions. These substitutions are rarely caught due to abbreviated inspection procedures and bribes at pretty much every level of the industry. This trend isn't something new either, as the reports were dated not from the 2020s but the 2010s. The Russian leadership's continued insistence that production is meeting military needs, despite evidence to the contrary, reflects a dangerous disconnect between political rhetoric and battlefield reality. This information gap has strategic consequences. Unrealistic production expectations lead to further corner cutting and quality degradation. Military planners base operations on ammunition supplies that won't arrive or simply don't even exist. Frontline commanders lose trust in the supply system, affecting morale and tactical decision making. Russia's military doctrine that is increasingly dependent on high-level officers means that the country will continue to lose soldiers at an unprecedented rate to cover for its failures elsewhere. Russia's ammunition crisis represents more than a simple supply chain problem. It's a systemic failure resulting from corruption, infrastructural limitations, and unrealistic political expectations. The consistent losses of stockpiles create even more problems for the Russian supply chain. If Ukraine proves that it can consistently attack Russia's supplies hundreds of miles away from its borders, the Russian military-industrial complex needs to move from the more populated and favorable west of the country to the sparse east. Those regions have their own share of issues. First, the country doesn't have the infrastructure to support building a new weapon stockpiles and transport munitions east-west at the scale needed to continue the war effort at the same pace. Secondly, you can't simply move production facilities to regions that have only a fraction of the population density and entirely different industrial focuses. The talent needs to move, which could spark severe protests and logistical delays. The situation illustrates how increasing budgets alone cannot overcome deeply entrenched institutional failures. For Russian forces, the consequences are immediate and severe. Artillery-centric tactics become less viable, operational flexibility decreases, and vulnerabilities increase. Without reliable ammunition supplies, Russia's numerical advantages in artillery systems become meaningless. Even with corruption eliminated and quality control restored, the physical constraints of ammunition production would remain. Manufacturing processes require time, specialized equipment, and expertise that cannot be conjured through political will alone. Until these fundamental issues are addressed, Russia's artillery and air defense units will continue firing fewer shells with less accuracy and to diminishing effect, regardless of how many rubles are allocated to solving the problem. Thus, the explosion at the 51st Arsenal is yet another reminder of Russia's fragile economy and industry being severely affected by the war. And Ukraine, learning quickly and adapting faster, is showing how a smaller force can punch well above its weight by targeting those vulnerabilities to turn Russia's once-hailed military into a laughingstock for the world to see. The question now is not whether Ukraine can strike again, it's how Russia will try to stop them and whether it still can. But what do you think? Do these attacks on Russian military stockpiles signal a shift in Ukraine's strategy? And how will Russia adapt to these growing vulnerabilities? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and thanks for watching. And don't forget to subscribe to The Military Show for more up-to-date news and information about conflicts in Ukraine, the Middle East, and around the world.